Thank you, everybody, for being here. The U.S.-Pakistan relations, reassessing priorities amid continued challenges is an important topic, and on the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, we look forward to addressing this, and we've invited you here because of your expertise. And you guys know how this works with the button in front of you. Make sure your microphone is turned on. You'll have a green light, goes yellow and red, and then you'll hear the gavel. We have votes that are going to come up between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. And typically what we do is we take a break. We ask if you can stay to hear your input when we come back, and we'll reconvene as quickly as we can. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with the opening statements. And again, I thank you for being here. The United States has sought a cooperative relationship with Pakistan for nearly 20 years, despite incompatible goals. Over the last year, this contradiction has come to an inevitable head. As we meet today, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is devolving. Faced with few good options in our fight to stabilize Afghanistan, the United States has spent about $33 billion on Pakistan since 2001. For years now, U.S. expenditures for Pakistan has decreased as it becomes more and more evident that our priorities are just not in alignment. Over the last 6 months, the administration has taken steps to sharply accelerate this trend. Though it's long overdue, the United States is finally facing the reality that the U.S.-Pakistan relationships needs to change. Counterterrorism cooperation has been central to this relationship, but the reality is that Pakistan has never shared the United States' commitment to eliminate terrorist activity in South Asia. We won't soon forget that Osama bin Laden was hiding in plain sight in Pakistan, or that Dr. Afridi remains in prison for the work that he did to help us capture Osama bin Laden. And this same attitude continues today. Pakistan wants a government in Kabul that it can control, or no government at all. That is why Pakistan continues to give a pass to extremists who seek to destabilize Afghanistan or attack India. Many members of Congress have argued for this dramatic recalibration of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, but as we move to the next stage, it's essential that we get it right. No matter what, Pakistan will continue to be central to U.S. strategy in South Asia and is increasingly important to the administration's emerging Indo-Pacific strategy. For decades, Pakistan and China have shared what they call an all-weather friendship and have drawn even closer in recent years. Pakistan has doubled down on its relationship with China as tensions with the United States have grown. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a central component of China's Belt and Road Initiative, offering economic benefits for Pakistan in exchange for China's direct access to the Arabian Sea. As many expected, this economic initiative has also begun to take on a military character. Last month, it was revealed that China will build its second overseas military facility in conjunction with a port at the Pakistani city of Gwadar. This is the second one in a short period of time, with the other one being in Djibouti. Pakistan's internal dynamics are also challenging to the continued partnership with the United States. Religious freedom and human rights concerns are long-standing and not improving. Now, fundamentalists and extreme voices are taking on a new prominence in Pakistani politics. Further divergence between Pakistan and the United States on values and principles will make cooperation all the more difficult and widen the gaps between our strategic priorities. If 2017 laid the groundwork for a recalibration of U.S.-Pakistan relationships, 2018 will help decide its future course. The President and Congress will need to determine how we want to shape and fund this relationship going forward, particularly with the budget season approaching. So I look forward to hearing the panel's thoughts today and hope their testimonies will inform a number of lingering questions as we work on the issues throughout the coming year. Are U.S. and Pakistani goals for South Asia fundamentally compatible? What elements of military and counterterrorism cooperation must be maintained, and which need to be reworked? How does Pakistan play in U.S. strategic priorities in the Indo-Pacific and our larger competition with China? And finally, what is the future of Pakistan society and government, and is Pakistan becoming less tolerant and a less suitable partner for the United States of America. I thank the panel for joining us to share their expertise on these issues and any others that the members may wish to raise. And with that, members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record without objection. The hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record to length limitations in the rules, and the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing record. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Pakistan is a highly consequential nuclear state, but all too often we look at Pakistan as just a single inanimate entity. With these hearings, we can look inside Pakistan. We have witnesses that can give us an understanding of what's going on in the country with its political, regional, and ethnic groups, and the state of Pakistani democracy, such as it is. Since 2001, the United States has provided $11 billion in economic aid, $8 billion in security aid. That's $19 billion. In addition to that, we have paid $14 billion in coalition support funds, which we are told the Pakistani military has used in anti-terrorist efforts in support of our war in Afghanistan. On the one hand, we have seen small improvements in the economic and political developments in Pakistan. We have, at least nominally, a civilian government that was elected in 2008 and with elections also in 2013, and an election scheduled for later this year. Pakistan has a small but growing middle class, a semi-active civil society and press, and a judiciary that has at times confronted the state. And USAID projects have helped in areas of energy, agriculture, education, and health, including helping to provide 3,000 megawatts of electric power generation to the Pakistan's national grid, management practices and technologies for 300,000 farmers, repair or build 1,300 schools, train 2,700 teachers. Still, we have challenges. In the area of civil and military relations, the military appears to have the upper hand. It influences or controls Pakistani foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis Afghanistan and India, and also seems to play a outsized role even on domestic policy. On issues of federalism, the Pakistani state dominates the provinces of Sindh and Baluchistan and the Pashtun areas, often with little regard for the citizens in those areas. Most egregiously, even though thousands of Pakistanis have lost their lives in terrorist attacks in the past decade, Pakistani security and intelligence agencies have not been playing, or often are not playing, a constructive role with regard to terrorism. Instead, they provide safe haven to terrorist groups that attack Afghanistan and India and are linked to grave human rights violations in Sindh and other parts of Pakistan. The United Nations Human Rights Committee and the State Department's report on human rights have noted serious concerns about hundreds of cases of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances in Pakistan, particularly in Sindh. Among those hundreds of cases, we have with us a witness who has been directly affected. In November 2015, Sindhi leader Dr. Anwar Lagari, the brother of one of our witnesses, was brutally murdered in Pakistan. The Pakistani government has not been very responsive to numerous inquiries made by the State Department at the request of myself and other members of Congress. The reason for Dr. Lagari's death and why his perpetrators have not been brought to justice, these are questions the Pakistani government must still answer. And then to compound that tragedy, on October 30th last year, Dr. Anwar Lagari's son, Asad Lagari, was found dead in suspicious circumstances and is suspected to be a victim of poisoning. I had met Assad Laghari when he was in Washington. He was pursuing a master's degree here in the United States. He was preparing to help his country deal with water issues. On August 18th last year, I wrote the State Department about these issues with 6 colleagues, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. I've also raised these issues on the House floor. We must focus on an end to extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances in Sindh and elsewhere in Pakistan. We must place a high priority on advancing genuine human rights and democracy in Pakistan, not just for the people of Pakistan who would benefit from human rights and democracy, but because a democratic Pakistan that respects the rule of law will be a true ally of the United States. As the chairman brought up, we're concerned still, of course, about the compound that Osama bin Laden had. He wasn't hiding in some nondescript apartment. A mile from the west point of Pakistan, a large protected compound. But those in the ISI who must have known bin Laden was there are still at high-ranking positions in the Pakistani government. Whereas Dr. Afridi, who helped us capture and kill Osama bin Laden, is in prison. Kind of tells you which side the Pakistan is in control in Pakistan. The Trump administration has strongly condemned Pakistan for its safe havens for terrorist organizations, including the Taliban. We could develop a political strategy to address Pakistan's concerns about India and Afghanistan. We should consider officially recognizing the Durand Line as the international border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, rather than just say that it is a matter to be discussed by the countries. And with the understanding that we gain here in these hearings, I hope that we develop a more effective policy toward Pakistan that understands its internal ethnic, religious, and political dynamics. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the ranking member. Next, we'll turn to Mr. Shabbat of Ohio, who incidentally used to be the chairman of this committee.
Thank you,
And I aspire to be as talented as he is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our relationship with Pakistan continues to be marked with frustration, oftentimes a lack of cooperation, and then sometimes it seems that there is mutual agreement and engagement, and things are looking positive. I want to give a tip of the hat to the gentleman from California here, Mr. Rohrabacher, who oftentimes has positions which I don't always agree with and other members don't always agree with. But in his defense of Dr. Afridi, I have to say he's been relentless, he's been committed, he's never given up, and he's absolutely right. The treatment that Dr. Afridi got, a friend of this country who actually, information which led, you'll have some folks, oh, well, we're not sure about this, but everything that I've seen, it led to the end of Osama bin Laden, who killed so many of our fellow citizens on that horrible day. And then to have him thrown in jail, and this is supposed to be a government that's our friend and that we give pretty substantial amounts of aid to every year. And I've generally voted for that aid over the years because I do think that, you know, if we cut it off, they're going to be even closer to China, and there's going to be ramifications there, and they have nuclear weapons and all the rest. So I understand we have to get along. We need to work together. But their treatment of Dr. Afridi is outrageous. It's indefensible, and it should change. And I would hope sooner rather than later. But I want to commend my colleague from California for never giving up on that. And that's in meetings and Republican conferences, in the face of leadership and demanding why they're not doing more, and why we're letting Pakistan just continue to keep this doctor in a dungeon. It's despicable, and thank you, Dana. We appreciate it. Till you do something bad, and then I'll have to disagree with you.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because I have to echo that. I mean, Mr. Rohrbacher has been out there consistently hammering that home pretty much every meeting we have, and I thank you for that. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Baer from California for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to the ranking member. Obviously, there are a lot of complicated regions in the world, whether it's the Middle East or Korean Peninsula, but as someone who focuses in on South Asia, I'd argue that this is one of the most complicated regions in the world. Whether it's our mission in Afghanistan, you bring in India and Pakistan, and it gets complicated. Whether it is the rise of India as a growing economy, as one that's being welcomed into the League of Nations and leaders in the world, and the amount of investment, what does that portend to the Indo-Pak relationship as India becomes a stronger nation and garners more attention? The hope is that Pakistan takes notice of some of the economic reforms that are taking place, some of the civilian reforms, and some of the anti-corruption events, and you try to find a resolution between India and Pakistan. There are areas where I think the U.S. working with other nations to address Pakistan's very concerning energy needs, their electrical grid, areas where you've got to take baby steps, but how do you create some sort of small dialogue and trust? How do we support civilian government in Pakistan? How do we create those civilian institutions that will be necessary to create stability and a democracy? Again, none of these are easy answers. What role does China play here? Does China and does Pakistan, as the U.S. Relationship with Pakistan changes, does Pakistan run to China as a counterweight? I'd argue that's the wrong approach, because China has shown a history of really China-centric involvement. That said, does China take a more responsible role in helping create stability as a global leader? So again, none of these are easy answers, and I think we all have to look at all of this together, but from the interest of Pakistan, looking at their long-term stability, their long-term, they have an educated population. They have a population that, they've got a diaspora here in the United States that's very interested in looking for a path forward in resolving tensions and lowering tensions between India and Pakistan, and hoping to see a more democratic Pakistan. So again, I look forward to the witnesses, and thank you for calling this hearing.
Thank you for your comments. And I want you guys to understand that when we have these hearings, your input is so valuable. It goes into ideas that we come up with legislation to help strengthen our foreign policy that we send to the state or the administration. And so we really value you're here, and we want to thank you for your time. And what I want to do is just introduce all four of you, and then we'll start with you, Dr. Jones, in your statement. Dr. Seth Jones, Harold Brown Chair and Director of Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Jeff Smith, Research Fellow for South Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Munawar Sufi Lagari, Executive Director at the Sindh Foundation. Dr. Shah Wick Carey, Assistant Professor of South Asian Politics in the Department of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Again, thank you for being here. Dr. Jones, your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, if I could speak out of order for a
Please.
second. We've got actually a whole bunch of chairs over here if the folks over there might want to come in and sit down.
And I appreciate you pointing that out, because I also wanted everybody just kind of glance around the room, see how packed this room is. People are interested about this topic, about our relationships with Pakistan on both sides. And so that's why this room is so crowded to overstanding. But feel free to come across if you got a moment right now, and thank you for pointing that out. Dr. Jones, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for allowing us to testify on this important subject that I think all of you that have spoken so far have indicated. I want to keep my remarks brief and focus on two issues. One is the security situation, which is what I've focused on, both in Pakistan and the region. And the second is just to lay out potential options for consideration. As I look at the security situation in Pakistan, what's interesting is we looked at the data is actually there's been a dramatic drop in violence levels in Pakistan, especially over the past 4 years. Attacks have declined fairly significantly, probably in part a function of Pakistan's counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in the country, including in the tribal areas, as well as against groups like the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan or Pakistan Taliban. Fatality rates are actually down somewhat. Lethality rates against groups are actually down somewhat. They are still high in a few places, including Baluchistan. But I think what we see is some successful efforts by the Pakistan state in some areas, quite lethal, as including on human rights issues that I think are worth bringing up. But we have seen a decrease. In neighboring Afghanistan, obviously the situation is different. We're seeing high levels of violence, Taliban control of somewhere between 10 to 12% of the Afghan population, depending on the numbers, and a pretty notable decrease in Afghan government control of populated areas up through 2017, about 60% of the country, down from nearly 70% about a year and a half ago. So the situation in Afghanistan is still quite violent, and the situation in Pakistan, while violent, appears to be, indicators appear to be lessening. Let me talk about next steps moving forward. And I'll skip, the testimony talks about a whole range of issues, including China-Pakistan cooperation. But let me focus on three things in the remaining time. One is broader relations with Pakistan. As someone who works on security, I do focus a lot on the security relationship, both with Pakistan and the region. I do think it is important to remember that there are other areas of interest with Pakistan. It's got the 6th largest population in the world. It's got a GDP of about 300 billion, which is on par with South Africa and Colombia. It's a reasonable country, and it's got a reasonable growth rate of about 5.5%. So there are areas, I think you talk to American companies that deal with iron and steel, agriculture, machinery, aircraft, that have an interest in trade, and then we get textiles, knit apparel, leather products from Pakistan as well. So there's an economic incentive to keep a relationship and to keep a trade relationship. There are also interests in targeting the Islamic State, Khorasan province, which sits really on the Af-Pak border in Nangarhar province, and that has conducted attacks, including recently in Jalalabad. So there are areas, I would say, of some common interest. I also think there's probably worth noting that any political settlement in Afghanistan almost certainly has to involve Pakistan because of its relationship with the Afghan Taliban. So assuming there are efforts to improve and establish some kind of a peace deal, I think Pakistan's an important partner. But let me just say in general that we have a situation, I think, with Pakistan that I still find unacceptable. The U.S. is fighting a war in Afghanistan, primarily against the Taliban and the Haqqani network. The leadership structure of both groups sits on the Pakistan side of the border. That is leader Hibatullah Akhundzada, his chief deputies, Siraj Haqqani and Mohammad Yaqub, a range of leaders, Abdul Qayyum Zakir, Ahmadullah Nanai, Abdul Latif Mansour, all located on the Pakistan side of the border, and that has not stopped. I think it's worth, if that does not stop, I think it's worth considering a range of issues. I'd like to see a more transparent, aggressive information campaign in the United States about who is sitting in Pakistan, roughly where they're located, what their names are, because I think we've got a lot that we can disclose without getting into sources and methods. That there are a range of issues from non-NATO ally status to multilateral financial lenders that I'll save for the question and answer period. But I think it's worth thinking very carefully about an escalatory ladder with Pakistan if some of that does not change. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Smith, if you would.
No improvement in Afghanistan is possible without Pakistan taking control of its border areas. That was the unfortunate inalienable truth revealed to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence nearly 1 decade ago by then Director of National Intelligence Admiral Dennis Blair. Sadly, it is true today as it was then. Military strategists are in near universal agreement on this point. Nothing offers an insurgency greater vitality than the provision of support and safe haven across an international border in a neighboring country. It is the equivalent of counterinsurgency kryptonite. The United States has been pursuing a set of objectives in Afghanistan that, by its own admission, are likely to remain hopelessly out of reach, absent a fundamental change in Pakistan's misguided strategic calculus. The reality is there is a glaring fundamental incongruity between American and Pakistani objectives in Afghanistan. Whereas Washington, Kabul, and most of the international community have strived to build a peaceful, stable, democratic Afghanistan, Pakistan's ideal objective is an Afghan government that is pliable, submissive, and hostile to India. Since the Afghan people, understandably bitter after over a decade of Pakistani malfeasance, are unlikely to elect such a government, Islamabad's second order of priorities is to keep the country weak, unstable, and divided. It sees the Taliban, Haqqani network, and their fellow travelers as the most effective means of doing so and of securing its secondary objectives and interests in Afghanistan. In 2009, the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan concluded that there was no chance that Pakistan would view any increase in aid as sufficient compensation for abandoning support to these militant groups. The following year, the U.S. increased aid to Pakistan by 50%, from $3 billion to $4.5 billion. That was the year 2010, which was telling in 2 more ways. It was the year that U.S. aid to Pakistan reached an all-time high, and the year that U.S. casualties in Afghanistan reached an all-time high. The Trump administration tried to signal early on that business as usual was coming to an end. This is a conditions-based approach, and our relationship with Pakistan will also be conditions-based, based on whether they take action. Secretary Tillerson explained last year. As longtime Pakistan watchers predicted, the administration's warnings fell on deaf ears. No, I have not seen any change yet in Pakistan's behavior, General John Nicholson, our top military commander in Afghanistan, admitted in November. Instead, Pakistan returned to a familiar playbook of deflection, denial, conspiracy, and outright threats. If President Trump wants Pakistan to become a graveyard for U.S. troops, let him do so, the chairman of Pakistan's Senate warned last August. In this context, President Trump's January 1 announcement of a suspension of U.S. aid to Pakistan was not only merited but long overdue. The time has come to rewrite the terms of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. For years, America and the international community have bemoaned the Pakistani military's interference in the country's politics. Yet they convinced themselves that as the country's real power brokers, the military was the only institution capable of resolving Pakistan's terrorism problem. That experiment has been a failure. The military and the ISI have consistently proven to be the source of Pakistan's terrorism problem. As a result, the most effective points of pressure on Pakistan will be those targeting the military brass, particularly their considerable interest in and access to the West. Pakistani officials and experts regularly claim their country is prosecuting America's war. Pakistan is not receiving aid from the U.S., it is receiving compensation for military operations conducted on America's behalf. Nation states are obligated to ensure that their territory is not being used to launch attacks on other countries. That is their sovereign responsibility, not something they are entitled to receive compensation for. If Pakistan is incapable of or unwilling to exercise sovereignty over its territory and prevent cross-border attacks, it should not be surprised when others take action to defend themselves. I have several other conclusions and quite a bit on the Pakistan-China relationship in my written testimony that I suspect we may get to in Q&A, but thank you.
No, thank you for your intuition on that and, pointing that out, because those are things that we need to delve into. Mr. Ligari, if you would, please.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the committee, let me thank you all for inviting me to this important hearing on U.S.-Pakistan relations. My focus mainly on Sindh province. Mr. Chairman, Pakistan is topic of much media discussions, but there is little media and political discussions about the Sindhis, who comprises about 14% Pakistan's population of just over 205 million people. Mr. Chairman, Sindhi people believed that becoming part of Pakistan would bring an end to religious wars and the prevalence of justice and rights. But hostility and tensions in the region have never ended. The United States can play a very important role in this region, particularly to bring about the eradication of terrorism and restoration of human rights. Mr. Chairman, Pakistan is a de facto military and state run by its army, Islamic jihadi outfits, and protected and promoted by the army as assets and as an important Pakistani foreign and defense policy tools. Militant Islam is the most powerful weapon of the Pakistani army. Islamic religious organizations have been and will always be their assets. They not only use these religious organizations against India, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, but also against the United States and Israel. Mr. Chairman, Sindh can be contrasted with Pakistan's military-dominated state. Jihad, Islam, and the army have always been features of the Pakistani state. Sindh's identity has always been peace, tolerance, coexistence, culture, and democracy. Sindh has always been at the forefront of pro-democracy struggles against military dictators in Pakistan. Sindh played leading role in the 1983 movement for the restoration of democracy. Mr. Chairman, Pakistan's official language, Urdu, is the mother tongue of the Indian Muslim migrants, currently only 8% of the total population. The state of Pakistan imposed Urdu as a tool of cultural repression upon the rest of the populations, Sindhis, Baloch, Pashtuns, Punjabis, Saraikis, and other native languages. This was of the reasons for the separation of Bangladesh in 1971. Injustice done to the indigenous languages has eroded the cultural identity of Sindh, replaced by the violence and extremism. The state has catered the interest of Punjabis and Muhajirs. Punjab has always been superior. Muhajirs have always been privileged. Meanwhile, Pashtuns, Sindhis, and Baloch have always suffered. Mr. Chairman, as long as you don't understand these ground realities, you will not be able to align American interest and relation with those of Pakistan. Hundreds of Sindhis nationalists are missing in Sindh, and thousands of Baloch nationalists are missing in Balochistan. Their enforced disappearances is part of the so-called strategic depth policy of Pakistan's army and ISI, because these activists are against the multi-billion-dollar CPEC. Young Sindhi Hindu women are being forcefully converted to Islam and made sex slaves of Islamic extremists in Sindh. Mr. Chairman, it is high time that the United States reconsider the nature of their relationships with Pakistan, their military, and the ISI. The US should also better its relationship with the pluralistic people of Sindh. I have many recommendations which is already in my full committee, but I want to, one recommendation which is, want to read it here. The Pakistani military and ISI should be held accountable for fraud and abuse of US resources, equipment, and money, which they use to hunt down to anti-jihadi Sindhi and Baloch dissidents instead of going against the jihadi and terrorist groups, including the Hafiz Saeed and Haqqani network. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate your input. Dr. Shah?
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and, sorry. Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for holding this very timely hearing on Pakistan and inviting me to testify. In my testimony, I'm going to focus on two key issues. The challenges to democratization in Pakistan and the repression of human rights and civil society by security services. Pakistan's fragile democracy is facing a serious threat from the military once again. The military in Pakistan has repeatedly intervened to arrest the development of democracy in the country, ruling indirectly for almost half the country's existence and maintaining a firm grip on national security policy and politics for the rest of the time. As Pakistan nears a crucial parliamentary elections later this year, the military's intelligence arm, the Inter-Services Intelligence, is reportedly trying to engineer an outcome that would undercut the electoral prospects of the ruling Pakistan Muslim League of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, with the ultimate aim of creating a divided and hung parliament. Mr. Sharif was ousted from office in July 2017 when the country's Supreme Court disqualified him from holding public office in a corruption inquiry linked to the Panama Papers. But the probe that became the basis of the court's decisions was led by military intelligence officials and marred by serious accusation of partiality amid reports of witness intimidation and illegal wiretapping of the witnesses' phones. But dishonesty is not the reason for Mr. Sharif's or other Pakistani politicians' predicament. Instead, it is their attempts to wrest authority from the military in matters of national security and foreign policy. Mr. Sharif has already been deposed twice in the past. In 1993 by a military-backed presidential decree, and in 1999 by General Musharraf's coup, mainly for seeking reconciliation with India and for asserting the civilian supremacy over the military. After assuming office for the third time in 2013, he ran afoul of the military once again for making peace overtures to India, for calling for an end to undue interference in Afghanistan, and his insistence that the ISI stop using jihadi terrorist group like the Lashkar-e-Taiba as proxies to promote perceived national security goals, which he believes has eroded Pakistan's internal coherence and international credibility. But rather than acting against these violent extremists, the military has now sought to convert them into political parties. The aim is to shield these groups from international sanctions and to balance and counter politicians like Sharif and others. If parliamentary elections take place as planned in mid-2018, it will be Pakistan's second transition from one elected government which has completed its term to another, a milestone in a country where all previous transitions to democracy were aborted by military coups or intervention. Pakistan achieved its first one in 2013. A second transition is more crucial because it would show that the country's political leaders and parties are unconditionally committed to democracy, even when they lose elections, and signal to the military that Pakistanis have the right to democratically change their leaders. Elections obviously do not equal democracy, but regular elections can help solidify democracy by habituating politically significant groups such as political parties, the military, and civil society to the fact that democratic procedures and norms are the only game in town. The experience of other military-dominated polities in Latin America and Asia shows that the certainty of the electoral process can empower democratically elected leaders to successfully roll back the institutional prerogatives of the military. Besides, violent extremists are less likely to find easy refuge in a democratic Pakistan. The stronger Pakistan's democratic institutions become, the less room the Pakistan military and its ISI will have to use jihadi proxies both for domestic and foreign adventures. Coming to the repression of human rights, the human rights situation in Pakistan is obviously dismal. The Pakistan military's continued institutional power and entrenched assumptions of impunity mean that human rights are likely to continue to deteriorate in the coming years. Particularly alarming is the issue of enforced disappearances of Baloch and Sindhi dissidents, social workers, peace activists, and journalists. There are official mechanisms that can address these human rights violations, including the National Commission for Human Rights and the Official Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearances. But their authority is limited by constraints, both budgetary and the fact that they are unable to prosecute military officers. For too long, the United States has focused narrowly on security in Pakistan, which has invariably meant a military-centric relationship at the expense of civilian democratic governance. I would recommend that Congress ensure that U.S. election monitors such as NDI and the RI coordinate their efforts with International Observer for the next elections to closely assess and monitor the electoral process. Congress should also review the composition of aid to Pakistan. And lastly, the U.S. should work with its allies to urge Pakistan to strengthen the Commission on Enforced Disappearance, the National Human Rights Commission, and to urgently ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Thank you.
Thank everybody for being on time with your statements and your passion. I appreciate that. This is something, as you guys have all pointed out, that we've seen Dr. Jones, I believe you were talking about the attacks are down in Pakistan because of the, or the attacks are down in Pakistan because of the, are they down because of the attacks in Afghanistan are going up? Are they just shifting? And then, Mr. Smith, I think it was you talking about the foreign aid, that we've had areas or times where we've had a lot of foreign aid going into Pakistan. We've had times where there was none going into Pakistan, and then we had moderate amounts, but yet the situation hasn't changed. So it kind of makes me think foreign aid is not the answer to this, to get people to come to the table. And we've seen the response of Pakistan. And so how should Congress interpret Pakistan's move to double down on its relationship with China as tensions with the United States rise? We'll go with you, Mr. Smith, first.
It's a great question, and you know, I think China has often been looked at as one of the few potentially effective avenues or mechanisms to affecting real change in Pakistan, because they do have a great deal of influence. They do give a great deal of money, like the U.S., but unlike the U.S., they're popular in Pakistan among the elite and the public. But what I think often gets lost in that discussion is that, and Andrew Small, I think, put it best when he said the Pakistan-China relationship is exactly as close as China wants it to be.
Right.
I don't know that Beijing is eager to see a fundamental rupture in U.S.-Pakistan relations and for it to assume responsibility as the sole patron of Pakistan and the commitments and responsibilities that come with that. Its support for Pakistan has already cost it in its relationship with India. It has cost it in the international community in some regards, and it costs a great deal financially in some regards. And I think another thing often lost is that the Chinese public views Pakistan just about as favorably as they view India, which is a historic rival of China's, and far less favorably than they view the U.S. So there's popular opinion in China to a degree that influences elite opinion as well, even if it's not a democracy. So I think in some ways a rupture in U.S.-Pakistan relationships that pushes Pakistan further toward China could actually expose some tensions in that relationship and may make China a more willing cooperator or collaborator.
Well, and you brought up a good point. They've got such an influence that they can, and I think what they'll find out in Pakistan and other countries with this one belt, one road, it's a one-way street that heads towards China's, for China's benefit. Although they can do great things with that, I think it's something that we should point out. It's like the port in Gwadar port shows that there's a close link to the Chinese military ambitions. I remember sitting with the Chinese ambassador talking about the Spratly Islands. It was strictly for peaceful navigational purposes. We know that's not true, and we've seen that repeated over and over again. Let me see. This will be for Dr. Shaw. Is the U.S.-Pakistan relationship at the point of no return, and do you believe that it's still accurate to call Pakistan an ally, given its history of the two-faced dealings on the war on terror?
That's a tough question. So Pakistan, as you are all aware, has kind of been as some people call it, a friend and an enemy or a frenemy. So it has, willingly cracked down on terrorists and militants that attack the Pakistani state, while protecting and sponsoring other groups like the Haqqani Network that hurt India and Afghanistan. U.S.-Pakistan relations have seen a kind of rise and fall throughout history, but I would imagine that it's not a breaking point yet, that the U.S. could still do things that might turn the kind of direction of the Pakistani state around, especially, as I emphasized, by promoting democracy, which has been missing from U.S. assistance to Pakistan for quite some time. There was a short period of the Kerry Lugar-Berman Enhanced Partnership Act that was emphasized for 5 years. But I think the real key is to have a long-term commitment to unconditional commitment to democratization in Pakistan and to build relationship with civilian leaders and civil society.
I hope we can come back to that question there, and I want to go to Dr. Jones. What would be the implications of stripping Pakistan of its status as a major non-NATO ally, which it acquired in 2004, thus ending its preferential access to American weapons and technologies?
Well, look, I think if the step of suspending or even terminating Pakistan's status as a non-NATO ally was part of a series of escalatory steps, and that went further, if it made no difference, Pakistan is not on the U.S. State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism, but we know, I was in the U.S. government, I mean, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that they do support Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Taliban, the Haqqani network. So my answer to you is, I don't know that it would have an immediate step of revoking it. I think it would, Pakistan could get that assistance potentially elsewhere, including from the Chinese, but if it's part of a process that is politically isolating Pakistan, I don't think that would be in their interest over the long run.
I agree with you, and thank you. We'll next go to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman.
2,000 years ago, the greatest imperial power was Rome, and all roads led to Rome. Today, all roads and belts lead to Beijing. Pakistan has been described as, well, in most places, the country has an army. In this case, the army has a country. I'm concerned with the efforts of elites in Islamabad to compel the use of the Urdu language nationwide. They tried that on what was then called East Pakistan. It is no longer referred to as East Pakistan. Last year, 7 members of Congress signed a letter condemning human rights violations in Sindh, especially regarding enforced disappearances, missing persons, and religious extremist attacks on minorities. Mr. Laghari, what can the U.S. do to help improve human rights in Sindh?
I think one great effort is already done, which is the first ever after the British. The U.S. has done their U.S. Consulate Karachi website is in Sindhi, which is really credit go to the this committee or Congressman Brett Sherman and Adam Schiff and Congressman Dana Rohrabacher who signed those letters. I think, but they still need at least this is from the long time the suggestion or the resolution means an appropriation committee about the Radio Voice of America and program in Sindhi, which is needed. That is the time needed because there's no voice for the Sindhi peoples, and I really highly recommend, and this committee can try to ask the State Department or the Voice of America that to start the Sindhi program in Voice of America.
I would point out that we have reduced our cost of foreign aid to Pakistan by many hundreds of millions or billions of dollars a year. In my work on this, I've seen a need for maybe 1.5 million to communicate with 30 million plus Sindhi speakers. Should we also have a Baluch radio service as well? I'll ask Mr. Laghari and also Dr. Shah.
I mean, I don't think it'll hurt to have such programming, but the problem in Balochistan is obviously deeply rooted in the Pakistani state's repression of legitimate Baloch demands for autonomy and a share of their resources. This is a province that now produces, I think, if I'm not wrong, about 36% of Pakistan's natural gas, but it receives a pittance in revenues from Islamabad. And the military has systematically abused human rights in Balochistan. Baloch dissidents have been kidnapped, tortured, and then dumped on the roadside. And in some cases, their bodies had engraved on them Pakistan Zindabad, or long live Pakistan. So Baloch alienation is growing, and this is not this is a middle class insurgency, by the way. There are doctors, engineers, and professionals who've taken up arms against the Pakistani state. And so, first of all, I think there is a need to outrightly condemn human rights violations in Balochistan, the rest of Pakistan, and to pressure Pakistan to at least respect its obligations to the international community in terms of adhering to the norm of human rights protection.
The Punjabi represent about 53% of the country. Do they get a do they represent a disproportionate percentage of the Army, the ISI, and especially the officer corps?
Historically, that has been the case. The Army does not release the ethnic composition of its officer corps, but estimates have ranged from 70 to 80% Punjabis, and then Pashtuns form about 15%, and the last 5% would be some Sindhi and Baloch and Mahajers, I believe.
I'll go down the row. How many, does anyone here think that over 10% of the officer corps is made up of persons other than Pushtun and Punjabi? Dr. Shah, you
No.
said? No. For the record, Mr. Lagari says no. Mr. Smith, Dr. Jones. So you have certain ethnic groups controlling the Army, and then the Army controls the country. And then we sometimes call it a democracy. I believe my time has expired.
Thank you. We'll next go to Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. President Trump has sent a message, a long overdue message, to the clique that rules the day in Pakistan. And now, today, the United States Congress, from this committee, is sending the same message. The clique that is ruling in Pakistan, this clique of Punjabis, rule with an iron fist. They are terrorists to their own people, and they are corrupt. They are not a legitimate government and should not be treated as a legitimate government, but instead a pariah that is not in the interest of its own people and certainly not in the interest of the United States. We have, over the years, given to them every benefit of the doubt we could. When I arrived here 3 decades ago, many people believed I was Pakistan's best friend on the Hill. I was. We were deeply involved in Afghanistan, and I spent a lot of time and effort on that particular issue. But over the years, it has become very clear to me that Pakistan is the root of the problem in Afghanistan. The ISI and the Pakistani government, which are synonymous in so many ways, have been at fault for keeping this conflict going and going and going. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of lives lost. We mentioned Dr. Friddy today. Dr. Friddy is symbolic of all of this. If you have a group of gangsters who have taken someone like a doctor and put him in prison in a dungeon because he helped discover and helped disclose the murderers of 3,000 Americans, well, what does that indicate to you about the people who put him in that dungeon? It is time for us to side with the people who are repressed by this, what I say, clique that rules, the regime that rules Pakistan. We need to side with the Baloch, who have their young men and women grabbed, murdered, and then dumped on their front lawn. We've got a group in Karachi, the MQM movement, that's basically a group of people that wanted to live with enterprise and have a zone where they could deal with the world in a commercial way, and they're finding their people murdered. They're finding their lives repressed by a small group of Punjabis who are basically, many of them don't even pay taxes in their country. We have spent $33 billion for Pakistan since 9/11. $33 billion. And they, with $33 billion, couldn't get themselves to help us destroy the poppy crops, the opium that is grown on the Pakistan-Afghan border. No, this has been a travesty. Our policy has been a travesty of cowardice or ignorance on the part of the United States, that we are supporting such a regime. And I would hope that instead that we send the message to the Sindhis, to the Baloch, to the MQM, and others in Pakistan. And there are small minorities of other faiths that are there that are being murdered all the time. Christians have been murdered in Pakistan at will, and there's never anybody arrested for it. So with this thought, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to ask the panel, I got 1 minute left, so it's got to be a yes or no. Do you think the United States should drop its, official relationship with Pakistan and begin dealing with those elements in Pakistan that believe in democracy and represent the people of their country, the Baluch, the Sindhis, the MQM, et cetera? Yes or no? Or, yeah, you can give it a sentence. Yeah, 30 seconds, go ahead.
I think the U.S. would work at both levels. Work with the, it needs to talk to the government, but it needs to also talk with.
I agree, because I don't believe that those people have power in Pakistan or the government. There may be a regime. Government means, in the United States, we believe government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And that's not what you have in Pakistan. You have people who are being terrorized by that clique. Mr. Smith?
The honorable colleague.
All right.
I agreed with you, except the MQM, because they are so involved in terrorism and tortures in Sindh province. But I'm no problem with the Muhajirs, other common Muhajirs, and because Muhajirs, the identity is the main issues. This is my stand, and I think United States also must play very importantly the relationship. We don't want to see another Taliban or the Rohingya type in Karachi or those things. This is my concern and things. I agree with you. So we have to cut off the official
You
relationship.
can bet whoever, when you see the Taliban emerging in Karachi, you can guess who's really behind it. One last.
I wanted to add to your concerns. Pashtuns in the federally administered tribal areas have also been subjected to systematic human rights violation. There, as we speak, thousands of Pashtuns gathered in the capital Islamabad seeking justice for a young man who was killed extrajudicially. Partly because his name is the same as the leader of the Pakistani Taliban, Masood. And so there has been, in Karachi, these human rights violations are being carried out by the security services in Karachi against Pashtuns as well. I don't think we should sever our relationship with Pakistan, but I think there's a need to seriously think about shifting our focus to dealing with and building our partnerships with civilian political leaders, civil society, the media, professional associations, other NGOs like the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan.
We'll come back to that. We need to move
Very
on.
much.
Next, we'll go to Mr. Swaze from New York.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get a little bit of more information from each of you. So I have three areas that I want to explore. One is you talk about, we should continue to try and work with the government, but there's a big difference in the government between the military and the civilian government. So I want you just to expound a little bit between the difference between the civilian and the military government. Number two is, we want to see them do a lot better job of policing their borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, we've been having a hard time with our borders in the United States of America, and there's a very long border in Pakistan as well. What can be done, what should the Pakistan government be doing more effectively to secure their long border with Afghanistan? And I'll ask you, Dr. Jones, first, and then I'm going to ask another question afterwards if I still have more time.
Sure. On the civilian and military, I think the U.S. has traditionally had a much closer relationship with the civilian side in general. Problems with the military have particularly been the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, which
Well, the U.S. has always had a very close relationship with the military as well.
Well, with some parts of the military, but I think when it comes to military intelligence, that's where the biggest source of friction have been on support to groups operating in Afghanistan, Haqqani's Taliban itself. That's been a breaking point, I think, and continues to be a source of significant friction.
So think of all the relationships that were built during the war in Afghanistan with the Russians and, Pakistan supporting the Mujahideen and the relationships that were built there. Those relationships still exist. How do they undo those relationships and get rid of the people that we're having a hard time with?
Well, look, there's a strategic rationale for why Pakistan continues to support these groups. They are pursuing Pakistan's foreign policy interests in Afghanistan as they are in India with Lashkar-e-Taiba. There could be a strategic rationale to change that kind of support. It is undermining U.S. interests in Afghanistan, it is undermining Afghan interests, it's undermining regional interests. That's a strategic decision, I think, that goes well beyond any kind of historical ties.
And what about the practical questions related to securing the border? What would you like to see happen more than it's not happening?
I'd like to see Pakistan conduct intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance to Taliban and Haqqani members crossing the border. They have the capability to do that. They haven't done it. They're also trying to build a wall right now. There may be that may be worth looking closely at, but it has to be done in conjunction with Afghanistan.
Mr. Smith?
I think in some ways it gets to the question of what is the military's cost-benefit calculation. And to date, they have not borne significant costs for their policy of using Islamist militants as an extension of foreign policy. They've gotten benefits from that strategy, but they haven't borne costs.
Do we think that's a policy that's promoted more by the military than by the civilian government?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how about securing the border? You want to add anything to that?
I have nothing to add, but I'm sure U.S. military commanders have a lot of suggestions for how Pakistan could better secure that border.
Mr. Ligari?
I think, well, look at even if you keep the relationship with civilian, but the control is Pakistani military, and even in the military, the ISI has the control of the military. So it's very difficult to control this ISI. They have the very longer interest in the whole world. Not
Is there a big tension between the civilian and the military government in Pakistan?
in last 70 years, if you see that any one single election, fair election happen in Pakistan, that time in 1970 and Pakistan break up. There's no fair election. After even it is controlled by the Pakistani inter-service. If you can control to the ISI, then you can maybe say that we can build a good relationship with the Pakistani military or ISI.
Dr. Shah?
Let me clarify that the ISI is actually part of the military's chain of command. It's not a rogue agency. Its head is a 3-star general who goes back to the military after goes back to the regular military. In terms of U.S.-Pakistan relations, I mean, there hasn't been a Pakistani dictator that the United States hasn't been in love with. The relationship has been completely military-centric. That's my one point. And there are deep tensions between the civilians and the military. On the border, I think there's a question also of willingness. It's not just a matter of capabilities. Does the Pakistani military really want to achieve those objectives that you identified to stop and prevent the Haqqani network? I think it's the opposite. They actually facilitate their insertion into Afghanistan.
Who are 2 or 3 people? Do I have a few more seconds, Mr. Chairman? Yes, who are 2 or 3 people that you think are the best people for if a congressperson was to go visit Pakistan? Who are the 2 or 3 best civilian people that you think we should talk to? Go ahead, Dr. Shah.
I would suggest not focusing on individuals, but institutions to build relationships with the Pakistani Senate and the National Assembly. There are politicians who, in both the Pakistan Muslim League and Pakistan People's Party, former Prime Minister, late Benazir Bhutto, who understand the urgency of ridding Pakistan of extremism, who want to have peace, have a peaceful relationship with India, who want to end interference in Afghanistan. So I think it's a matter of building ties with institutions more than individuals.
Do you want to add anything, Dr. Jones or Mrs. Smith or Mr. Ligari?
No, strongly agree, institutions, and strongly agree with organizations like the Senate.
I also add the judiciary too.
Sure. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we'll next go to Ms. Wagner from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing. And I appreciate your continued attention to our, what I'll call, changing relationship with Pakistan. Mr. Smith, you recently wrote that you foresaw stronger Indo-U.S. and, Pakistan ties as the balance of power in Asia shifts. We can already see that China is investing staggering amounts of money, over $50 billion in Pakistan, and has been especially active in the port town of Gwadar. What kind of game is China playing with Gwadar? Is it an attempt to isolate India, or is China laying the groundwork for long-term competition with the United States, sir?
I think China has both commercial and military interests in the port of Gwadar. You know, going back a decade, a lot of Indian strategists were concerned about and publicly complaining about the possibility China would build a string of pearls of port facilities and logistics facilities along the Indian Ocean rim. And those concerns were sort of downplayed at the time, but I think they may have just come a decade too early, because what we have seen in recent years is that China does have plans for military facilities and installations.
I should say so. President Trump has advocated for a 350-ship Navy. Given that China seems to have designated Gwadar a future PLA naval base, are we doing enough to prepare for China's creep westward?
Well, one of the things we should be doing, and we are doing, I would commend the Trump administration on this, is strengthening our partnership with India across all the services, political, civilian, military. That, in some ways, we see India as a net provider of security in the Indian Ocean, and that partnership has made really dramatic progress over the past 10 years. And I think we have a unique situation with Prime Minister Modi in India and this Trump administration very bullish on the India relationship to move that forward. That, more than anything, a strong U.S.-India partnership, more than anything, will secure our interests in the Indian Ocean.
I have several more questions. Last fall, Pakistan refused to capitulate to China's demand that it accept Chinese currency within the Gwadar free zone. Dr. Shah, do you see Beijing's funding conditions for the China-Pakistan economic corridor becoming a wedge issue that inhibits cooperation between the two countries?
There have been reports of rising tensions. Pakistan also refused a major Basha Dam. I think the Chinese help in that because the conditions were too stringent. Pakistan's Minister for Shipping told the Senate that 90% of the revenues from Gwadar will go to China. So I think Pakistani officials are beginning to realize that this is really not about Pakistan's economic development per se, but it's about Chinese commercial economic interests. And so there is tensions also amongst the smaller provinces because they feel like, again, this project has been hijacked by the Punjab and left them out of the loop. So there's domestic tension, but there's also frictions with China on certain issues, including the currency issue.
I've got several more questions, but to whomever can best answer, would you recommend that Congress spell out specific conditions on our funding to Pakistan in the upcoming appropriations process? Mr. Lagari?
I think especially human rights situations, they put the condition on that one. And the Sindhi and Baloch, this disappearance issues is very critical. I would prefer.
Sir, as you well know, the systematic human rights abuses perpetuated by the Pakistani military. I mean, I am interested in reforming our IMET military education program to better train participating officers from Pakistan and around the world on human rights. What steps does the Pakistani military need to do to respect the fundamental rights?
Well, I haven't seen any delegation from the U.S. or even the Karachi consulate or the and Islamabad ambassador. They have to meet at least the disappearances families or extrajudicial families. That will go to the message to the Pakistani army that the U.S. is really concerned about the human rights situation. And whatever the equipments and training the U.S. is giving to the Pakistani military or the police, even or the the law enforcement agencies.
I appreciate it. I'd be interested in all of your perspectives on this, but let me just get this last question in. Just 2 days ago, the Pakistani Taliban claimed responsibility for a suicide attack that killed 11 soldiers in the Swat Valley. Dr. Jones, a few years back, you wrote that Pakistan had used proxy warfare to try to inspire regime change in Afghanistan. Is it still doing so? And do you think the U.S.'s new positioning could encourage Pakistani counterterrorism efforts?
I think Pakistan does continue to use proxy organizations, particularly in Afghanistan and India. Pakistan has shown a willingness to conduct counterterrorism operations against groups that threaten the state, groups like the Pakistan Taliban. but not against groups that they use as tools. So they differentiate between terrorist groups. I think the challenge for the U.S. is to try to get them to stop supporting groups undermining U.S. interests.
Here, here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me go over. I yield back.
Absolutely. I appreciate your input, and I thought those were great questions. You know, what we've seen is, and I think it was Mr. Lagari, you brought up one of the shortfalls of our foreign policy, and most grave is us not understanding the local cultures, tribe, mentality, or the power structures that we don't have here. And we've seen this repeated in Afghanistan. We've seen it repeated all over the Middle East. And you would think, you know, one of the things that would bring us all together would be to have a common goal in stomping out radicalism in any shape and form, that we'd all come together and we could agree on that. And then move beyond that and focus on economies and trade and cultural exchanges. But I don't see that happening, and what we have around the world is people have hijacked religions or bastardized them. We've seen what the radicals have taken with Islam, but we've also seen them do that with democracies, and both of them have gotten a bad name. You know, we heard in other meetings that democracy is a failing structure and China's promoting that, yet what we see around the world in so many countries is not a true democracy, you know, where the people are empowered. What we see in so many countries is the government is still in power, but they want to call it a democracy, and when it doesn't work, they blame democracy instead of their small thinking. And they don't empower their people. And what I've seen is governments are afraid to empower people that haven't formed a government like ours from the bottom up. And we're just so blessed in this country that we have empowered our people, and we give people the right to have the control of the government, and it's just such a foreign concept to so many countries. Moving forward, I didn't have a question with that. That was more just of a statement in case we ran out of time. But what I want to ask all four of you, if you will, is what are your thoughts about Pakistan's, you know, knowing Dr. A.Q. Khan and the work he's done, and the laxity of what's going on in there, and not knowing who the power structure is. We know it's in the hands of the military, but we see one of the groups growing as one of the extremists as a candidate. What are your thoughts about the nuclear arsenal being passed off to the wrong hands, and what can the U.S. do about it? Go ahead, we'll start with you, Mr. Lagari.
Yeah, this is very interesting question for me. I think if you look at that, we are talking about the Iran and North Korea. But who gave the nuclear, all those things
Exactly.
in Pakistan? And this is not, I don't think that just is by A.Q. Khan, but definitely is involved by the other Pakistani military and ISI. Without their permission, they can't even transfer that things from the airport or anything. So they're taking the bags and those things. And one more threat to the, I think would be, I want to alarm the situation, if that nuclear, if controlled by the Taliban, or means nature, or by the extremist or the Islamic fundamentalist groups, then it will be the more very, very dangerous and horrible things for the whole world. And instead of that, if you look at when this nuclear things in 1998 this happened, even the chief minister from the Balochistan, the Pakistani government haven't asked from them that we are doing this one. So imagine the democracy, or how they are treating the people in Sindh or Balochistan or the smaller province. My suggestion, like you point said, focus on the common people's educations and human rights. That would be. But nuclear things is a very, very dangerous thing if it is not controlled. But it's like a Walmart for
Right.
Pakistan.
Let me ask, does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Brief remark, this has obviously been a sort of omnipresent concern for a long time. Our military and intelligence folks here seem to think that the Pakistanis have reasonable confidence in the processes and procedures to control the nuclear weapons, but were the country ever to descend into chaos, you know, all bets are off. One thing I would note is that China continues to supply Pakistan with nuclear reactors. What many believe is in contravention of its commitments to the Nuclear Supplier Group, which it joined in 2004, and it continues to block India's bid to join the Nuclear Suppliers Group insisting that Pakistan should be given a chance too. And of course, Pakistan's record on nonproliferation suggests it should not be given consideration.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Just briefly, I mean, my understanding, even during my time in the U.S. Department of Defense, is that Pakistan had reasonable oversight over its nuclear capabilities. However, if the U.S.-Pakistan relationship deteriorates, as it may, I think it has to be made very clear to Islamabad that the proliferation of nuclear material or dual-use technology that gets out of Pakistan will be dealt with harshly. And that needs to be made, I think, clear publicly.
Unfortunately, that's one of those weapons that we wish we could uninvent, but we can't. We're here, and we've got to deal with it, and we have to have the safeguards in place. If you guys will bear with us, we're going to go to Mr. Sherman now for another round.
Are the major political parties in Pakistan dedicated enough to democracy to work together for democracy? Or are any one of them, the major parties, willing to team up with the military if they can just get a piece of power? I'll ask Dr. Shah.
I think that the Pakistan Muslim League, which is the ruling party, the Pakistan People's Party, which was until recently the other major party, I think are sufficiently committed to the process of democracy and have come to the consensus that a military intervention would be unacceptable. So at times when the Sharia...
So either one of them would prefer the other one be in power than that the military be in power, and they could be kind of junior partners to the military.
Absolutely. I think those two parties are committed to that. But there's a third force in politics now with a cricketer, Imran Khan, who is, empathizes with the Taliban. And he has been teaming up with the military to undermine elected governments. And every time, the military and civilian frictions rise, he starts questioning the very legitimacy of the democratic process, the elections being unfair. The major parties are committed, but there are problems with his party is called the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, or Pakistan Movement for Justice.
But not so much justice as is he motivated by Muslim extremism, or he's just a cozy relationship he has with the military?
I don't think he's driven by Islamic extremism, but he's expressed views in the past that are troubling. For instance, he said that the Taliban are justified in carrying out jihad in Afghanistan. So, but
I might add that if somebody said that in the United States, we'd call it Muslim extremism. But let me go to Mr. Lagari.
There is the democracy in Pakistan is the very unique. If you see currently the chief minister in Balochistan, he received only 450 votes, and only one seat, and he became chief minister. 450 votes. This is very rare. And the second thing, I go from not many religious parties in the parliament. Not many religious means the Jamaat Islami or those organizations. But the two other factors is very impactable in democracy. One is corruption nowadays. The Pakistani former president Asif Zardari, he collect lots of money through corruption. And also the Nawaz Sharif, I also suggest the CRS must be research on the corruption in Pakistan.
Have a choice between a undemocratic military and the two leading political factors seem to be involved in corruption. I'll be meeting at 4:45. And any member of the committee is welcome to join me with Bilawal Bhutto Zardari. So I'll ask Mr. Smith and Dr. Jones, what should I know about this gentleman, and what question should I ask?
There actually is an interesting story about...
Yeah, I mean, here's his mother's killed, his father's in jail.
Yeah.
Gee, and sometimes I think being a politician in the United States is tough. Go on.
Well, back in 2008, President Zardari issued an order that would have brought the ISI, shifted control of the ISI from the Prime Minister's office, where it ostensibly resides today, to the Interior Ministry, which many interpreted as an attempt by the civilian government, a rare attempt by the civilian government, maybe to exert some authority over the ISI. Within 24 hours, he received a letter from the military, essentially telling him, absolutely not, rescind your order today, and he did. He did. There have, since then, as far as I know, been no attempts by the civilian governments or the political parties to unite in an attempt to present a united front against the military. That simply has not happened.
Dr. Jones.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking and trying to get the pulse of this year's elections. I mean, they're coming up. Is his assessment likely to be we're going to see competitive, free, and fair elections? What are going to be the obstacles? I mean, that family's had a long historical, both has been victorious and also felt the brunt of the Pakistan's political system. So I would ask about the elections this year.
Mr. Ligari, Dr. Shaw, anything to add?
He has made the right statements recently, both in favor of the democratic process, minority rights, and as well as I forget now. Sorry, my mind just blanked out. I apologize. So he's made the right noises about democracy, human rights, minority rights, freedom of the press, which has historically been the Pakistan People's Party's trend to support human rights, because it's used to be quite left of the center, but it's now a centrist, moderate force. I would ask him about the performance of the Sindh government, because there are serious concerns about the PPP is in power in Sindh, but there are serious concerns about poor governance and corruption. So I would probably raise that too.
I want to add two things. One is the government in Sindh is PPP, and there is no single statement from neither from the Bilawal Bhutto nor from the chief minister about the disappearances. And the water issue is very serious. The poison kind of in the whole Sindh, and even from the judiciary they are asking, but there's no progress about that one.
Gotcha, disappearances and water. And I might, I've been working to try to get broadcasting into Pakistan 24 hours in all the major languages. And I've been told, it's so expensive. It could cost over $1.5 million. I think our chain per language, not per year, per year, per language. I think that's rounding error on the foreign aid and military aid. Sure. So something we can certainly afford to do. And I have a feeling I'd rather have a good relationship with the Pakistani people than with the folks that have put Dr. Afridi in jail. And with that, I yield back.
No, those are some good points, and ideally that's what we'd like to accomplish, is have a vibrant democracy over there in the form that fits their country best, to empower their people the best, so it brings stability around the region, around the world. I just know that what we're doing, we've got to change to continue down this path. We're not getting the results that we're looking for, and it just leads to destabilization around the region, if not the world. And so our recommendations will come out of this meeting. Hopefully you'll be able to see them, and we just want to let you know how much we appreciate the panelists, the witnesses, you guys being here with your input. We value it very much. We value your time, and so thank you. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.